Have you ever wondered how a handful of scattered colonies turned into the most powerful country on Earth? Tonight, we begin a long, calm journey through the full history of the United States, from the very first settlers, all the way to the modern day. So lie back, take a deep breath, and let's travel through time, slowly and peacefully. Hello and welcome. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the story of the United States, how it began, what it endured, and how it changed across centuries. This won't be a list of dates or a loud retelling of wars and revolutions. It will be a calm, detailed walk through the layers of time, through the forest. Before there was a United States, before the first colonies and ships, there were only the lands. Quiet rivers flowing endlessly. Great plains stretching far beyond the eye. Vast forests filled with deer and birds. Mountains standing like ancient giants. For thousands of years, Native American tribes lived across these lands. They fished, hunted, farmed, built towns, and traded. They spoke hundreds of different languages and followed traditions passed down through generations. There were the Iroquois in the Northeast, powerful, organized, and skilled at diplomacy. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, who built cities from stone and adobe in desert lands. The Sioux and Cheyenne of the plains, who followed bison herds across wide grasslands. The Cherokee, Choctaw, and Seminole in the South, living in river valleys and woodlands. Each tribe had its own way of life, deeply tied to the land. But everything began to change in the late 1400s. In 1492, a sailor named Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, reached islands in the Caribbean. Though he never stepped on the land that would become the United States, his voyage began a wave of European exploration that would forever alter the Americas. Over the next century, explorers from Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands arrived on North American shores, claiming land and building outposts. The Spanish settled the Southwest and Florida. The French explored along the Mississippi and in Canada. But it was the English who would leave the most lasting mark on what would become the United States. In 1607, the English founded Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English colony in North America. The settlers hoped to find gold, but what they found was hardship, starvation, disease, and harsh winters. They survived only with help from the local Powhatan people, though this relationship grew tense and often violent. Just over a decade later, in 1620, a group of English separatists, later known as the Pilgrims, landed further north, in what they named Plymouth. They were seeking religious freedom, and built a colony in what is now Massachusetts. More settlers followed, and soon a network of English colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. But these early colonies were not yet united. Each had its own rules, its own culture, and its own struggles. Still, something was growing, slowly, quietly, the roots of an idea that maybe this distant land could be something new. Something not ruled by kings an ocean away. Something shaped by the people living in it. And so, our journey begins, in the forests and harbors of early America, among strangers trying to survive, and a land already rich with ancient stories. As the colonies grew, so did their complexity. By the early 1700s, there were 13 British colonies along the Atlantic coast, each with its own economy, identity, and rhythm of life. Some thrived on trade, others on farming, and others still on the labor of enslaved people brought across the ocean in chains. From New England's cold harbors to the hot, tobacco-rich fields of Virginia, a new world was taking shape, but not without tension. The British Crown saw the colonies as a source of wealth, taxing their exports, regulating their imports, and watching closely for any signs of rebellion. For a long time, colonists accepted this arrangement. They were British subjects, after all. They spoke the same language, prayed in the same churches, and taught their children loyalty to the king. But as time went on, something began to shift. Across the colonies, people started to feel a quiet discomfort. They worked hard, built cities, carved farms out of the wilderness. Yet every major decision was made in London, by men who had never set foot on American soil. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't loud, but a question began to form in the minds of merchants, farmers, craftsmen, and thinkers. Why should a distant king decide how we live? In 1754, a war broke out between Britain and France, fought across forests, rivers, and hills of the American frontier. Known as the French and Indian War, it lasted nearly a decade, and while the British emerged victorious, the cost was enormous. To pay their war debts, Britain turned again to the colonies, raising taxes, tightening laws, and sending soldiers to enforce them. The colonists, already feeling distant from the crown, now felt pressured, watched, and used. Laws like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts placed taxes on paper, tea, glass, even legal documents. Protests followed. Colonists organized boycotts, published angry essays, and gathered in town squares to speak against unfair treatment. In Boston, a group of colonists dumped an entire shipment of tea into the harbor, a quiet harbor that suddenly echoed with defiance. Britain responded with force. It closed ports, sent troops, and tried to silence rebellion. But the silence had already been broken. In taverns, churches, and homes across the colonies, ordinary people debated ideas once whispered only among philosophers: liberty, self-rule, the right to resist tyranny. Then, in 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. They didn't speak of revolution, not yet. They spoke of rights, of representation, of peace, but under the surface, something powerful stirred. They were no longer just colonists. They were beginning to see themselves as something else entirely. And in the spring of 1775, on a quiet field in Massachusetts, British soldiers and colonial militia faced each other. A shot rang out. No one knows who fired first. But in that single, echoing moment, everything changed. The time for questions had ended. The shot heard in Lexington was not just a spark, it was a signal. In the months that followed, the war raged on. George Washington, tall and steady, took command of the Continental Army. His troops were often barefoot, hungry, cold, especially during the brutal winter at Valley Forge, but they endured. They marched through snow, crossed frozen rivers, and fought battles in forests, fields, and small towns. Sometimes they won. Often they didn't. But they didn't stop. France, seeing a chance to weaken its old rival, joined the fight. French ships, soldiers, and supplies turned the tide. And in 1781, at a place called Yorktown, Virginia, British General Cornwallis surrendered. Cannons fell silent. Drums faded. A long, painful war had ended, and something new had begun. But victory did not bring peace. The war had created a country, but not yet a nation. There was no president, no strong central government, no clear future. The original attempt, the Articles of Confederation, left the country weak, fragmented, and often in chaos. States argued, debts piled up, and foreign powers circled like hawks. In 1787, once again in Philadelphia, a group of delegates came together, not to declare independence this time, but to design a system that could hold it together. Over a long, sweltering summer, they drafted the United States Constitution, a document that built a government of checks and balances, separation of powers, and a promise of a more perfect union. It was not perfect. It left out many. It protected slavery. It raised new questions even as it answered old ones. But it provided a structure, a foundation on which the nation could begin to grow. And in 1789, George Washington, the quiet general who had once refused to become king, became the first president of the United States. No crown, no throne, just a man in a plain suit, taking an oath with his hand on the Bible, standing before a country still unsure of what it was, but ready to find out. The United States in the 1790s was small, young, and uncertain. 13 states, loosely stitched together by a constitution barely dry with ink, tried to navigate a world dominated by empires, kings, and ancient powers. The roads were rough, the borders unclear, and the idea of being American was still new, fragile, and unfamiliar. People still thought of themselves as Virginians, New Yorkers, or Georgians before thinking of themselves as citizens of one united country. George Washington, now president, moved with careful steps. He understood that everything he did would set a precedent. He surrounded himself with advisors, brilliant, opinionated men like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, whose views often clashed, sometimes bitterly. Jefferson dreamed of a nation of farmers and individual liberty. Hamilton saw cities, industry, and a strong central government. Their debates shaped policies, newspapers, and even friendships. In those early years, America faced enormous challenges. The economy was unstable. War debts loomed. British troops still lingered in forts across the Northwest. On the western frontier, settlers clashed with Native American nations, who fought to defend their lands from rapid expansion. To the south, Spain controlled Florida. To the north, Britain held Canada. To the east, the Atlantic Ocean separated the United States from the great powers of Europe. But it didn't keep them away. Then came the French Revolution. In France, people rose up against their king, inspired in part by the American struggle for freedom. But what followed was chaos, bloodshed, and war across Europe. Americans were divided. Some supported revolutionary France, others feared the violence and sided with Britain. Washington, determined to keep America out of another foreign war, issued a proclamation of neutrality, a bold move for such a weak young nation. When Washington chose to step down after 2 terms, peacefully giving up power, it was a moment almost unheard of in history. He warned against political parties and foreign entanglements, though the country soon ignored both. His farewell set a tone that shaped the presidency forever. John Adams, the second president, faced a deeply divided nation. Political parties had emerged, the Federalists favoring a strong national government, and the Democratic Republicans advocating for states' rights. Tensions grew quickly. When conflict with France threatened to spill into war, Adams chose diplomacy, a decision that cost him politically, but likely saved the country from chaos. Then came the election of 1800, a bitter contest between Adams and Jefferson. For the first time in modern history, power passed peacefully between 2 rival factions, not with violence, but with balance. It was proof that this fragile experiment in self-government might actually work. Jefferson's presidency brought new changes. He reduced the size of the federal government, slashed the military budget, and emphasized the importance of individual freedom. But perhaps his most lasting legacy came in 1803, when he approved the Louisiana Purchase, a vast, unexpected deal that doubled the size of the country overnight. And with it came a question that would haunt the nation for decades. How far would America grow? And who would control its future? The Louisiana Purchase was more than just a land deal. It was a moment that reshaped the map and the imagination of an entire people. For $15 million, the United States acquired over 800,000 square miles from France, land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. It was wild, unmapped, and mostly unknown to Americans. But to President Jefferson, it was a canvas, open land for farmers, pioneers, and the promise of a self-sufficient, agrarian republic. To explore this vast territory, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their journey, beginning in 1804, would become legend. They traveled by canoe, horse, and foot through rivers, mountains, and forests, guided in part by Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman whose knowledge and presence proved invaluable. For over 2 years, the expedition mapped terrain, documented wildlife, and made contact with dozens of native nations. When they returned, they brought not gold or treasure, but something even more powerful: the idea that the American frontier was limitless. As settlers moved westward, they encountered lands already occupied by Native American nations. Treaties were made, and often broken. Tribes were pushed further west, or into conflict. This expansion carried a silent cost, not just in lives and land, but in the growing tension between the nation's ideals and its actions. Meanwhile, beyond the frontier, trouble brewed on the seas. Britain and France were at war again, and both sides harassed American ships. British forces even captured American sailors, forcing them into service. Trade suffered. Tempers flared. And in 1812, the United States declared war on Britain once again. The War of 1812 was chaotic, often disorganized, and deeply unpopular in some regions. British troops marched into Washington, D.C., and set fire to the Capitol and the White House. But American forces held their ground in key battles, most famously in Baltimore, where the defense of Fort McHenry inspired Francis Scott Key to write the words that would later become the national anthem. In 1815, General Andrew Jackson led a diverse group of soldiers, frontiersmen, and free black volunteers to a stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans, though the war had technically ended weeks earlier with a peace treaty. Still, the battle gave Americans a renewed sense of pride, unity, and identity. The years that followed became known as the Era of Good Feelings, a time of national optimism and political calm. The country was growing in size and population. Canals and roads connected distant regions. New states entered the Union. Industry began to take root in the North, while the South continued to rely on agriculture and on the labor of enslaved people. But beneath the surface, sharp differences remained. The question of slavery, whether it would expand into new territories, whether it could continue at all, lingered like a storm on the horizon. Compromises were made to delay the conflict, but none could erase the fact that the nation was growing in two very different directions. And though the stars on the flag multiplied with each new state, so did the pressures threatening to pull those stars apart. By the 1820s, the United States stood taller, prouder, and more confident than ever before. The Mississippi River had become a lifeline for trade and movement. Cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia buzzed with commerce and immigrants. New technologies, steam engines, spinning machines, and telegraphs began to change daily life. People could travel faster, communicate across distance, and imagine a future that stretched far beyond the horizon. But for all the signs of growth, a deeper conflict was quietly unfolding. The North and South, though tied together by trade and government, were evolving along very different paths. In the North, factories and railroads powered a wave of industrialization. Cities expanded. Free labor became the norm. Education spread. Meanwhile, in the South, vast plantations depended more than ever on enslaved labor to grow cotton, the crop that now fueled both domestic wealth and global trade. As each new territory was settled, a question immediately followed: would slavery be allowed there? It wasn't just a regional issue, it was a national one. Every new state had the power to shift the balance in Congress. If one side gained too much control, the other feared it would lose its voice and its future. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise tried to hold the country together. Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and a line would be drawn across the map. Above it, no slavery. Below, allowed. For the moment, the tension eased, but everyone knew the compromise was temporary. A line on a map could not settle a moral divide. During this time, a new kind of politics emerged. Andrew Jackson, a war hero from the Battle of New Orleans, rose to power as the voice of the common man. His presidency marked a shift away from the elite founders and toward a new era of populism, personal loyalty, and raw political combat. He battled the national bank, expanded executive power, and reshaped how Americans thought about democracy. But Jackson's legacy is also shadowed by tragedy. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, forcing Native American tribes to leave their ancestral lands and relocate west of the Mississippi. This led to the infamous Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee men, women, and children marched through freezing weather, hunger, and disease. Many never made it to the end. Meanwhile, voices against slavery grew louder. In northern towns, abolitionist newspapers spread fiery words. Escaped slaves like Frederick Douglass spoke before crowded halls, telling stories that pierced through indifference. The Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses and brave volunteers, helped enslaved people flee to freedom. Tensions flared again with the annexation of Texas, followed by war with Mexico in 1846. When the dust settled, the United States had gained a vast new swath of land, stretching to the Pacific Ocean. It was a moment of triumph for many, a fulfillment of what some called manifest destiny, the belief that America was meant to expand coast to coast. But once again, the old question returned. Would slavery follow the flag? Each step westward brought the nation closer to the edge. By the 1850s, the United States had stretched from Atlantic to Pacific, a vast and varied land, filled with opportunity and tension in equal measure. Railroads crisscrossed the landscape. Cities like Chicago and San Francisco exploded with growth. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and China arrived in huge numbers, seeking work, land, and a better life. But beneath this progress, the nation was splitting at its seams. Each new territory added to the Union became a battlefield, not just of politics, but of identity. Was America a land of liberty, or a land of bondage? Could both North and South exist within one nation, or were their visions of the future too different to reconcile? The Compromise of 1850 tried again to quiet the debate. California would enter as a free state, and a stronger Fugitive Slave Act would be enforced, requiring that escaped enslaved people be returned to their owners, even from free states. But rather than calm the storm, it poured fuel on the fire. In the North, the law was seen as a moral outrage. In the South, resistance to the act was viewed as betrayal. Then came a book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, told the human story of slavery, not with laws or statistics, but with heartbreak. It became a sensation. In homes and churches, people read it aloud. For many, it was the first time they saw slavery not as a political issue, but as a human tragedy. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act opened new territories to settlement and let them decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. What followed was a wave of bloodshed known as Bleeding Kansas. Towns were raided. Homes were burned. Neighbors turned on each other. It was a preview of what the whole nation might soon face. A new political force emerged in the North, the Republican Party, dedicated to stopping the spread of slavery. One of its rising voices was a lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Known for his careful words and deep moral clarity, he warned that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Many listened. Others bristled. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott decision that enslaved people were not citizens. and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories. It was a devastating blow to abolitionists, and a clear signal that the federal government would not settle the dispute. Then, in 1859, an abolitionist named John Brown raided a federal armory at Harper's Ferry, hoping to spark a slave uprising. He was captured and executed, but his death became a symbol, a line in the sand. To some, he was a madman. To others, a martyr. And finally, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. He promised not to abolish slavery where it already existed, but to stop it from spreading further. That was enough. Southern leaders saw his election as a threat to their entire way of life. Before he even took office, 7 Southern states voted to secede from the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America. They believed they were protecting their rights, their land, their economy. But above all, they were protecting the institution of slavery. The nation had broken in two, and the shadow of war was now too large to ignore. By the spring of 1861, the storm that had been building for decades finally broke. On April 12th, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, a federal fort in South Carolina. The shells fell slowly at first, echoing across the harbor. No one died in the initial exchange, but the message was unmistakable. The Union was no longer whole. War had begun. What followed was not a short, sharp conflict. It became a long, grinding test of survival, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, a modern war on ancient soil. The Confederacy was built from 11 Southern states, confident in their cause, and led by Jefferson Davis. They believed they could defend their land, outlast Northern will, and gain international support from nations that relied on Southern cotton. Their armies fought to preserve a way of life rooted in slavery, tradition, and independence. The Union, under President Lincoln, fought not just to preserve the country, but to redefine it. At first, the war was framed as a battle to preserve the Union. But as the fighting wore on, and the death toll climbed, the purpose evolved. It became a fight for freedom, and a reckoning with the nation's deepest contradiction. Battles erupted across the land. In the East, armies clashed in Virginia and Maryland, places like Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg. In the West, Union forces slowly gained ground, seizing control of key rivers and railroads. Thousands died in fields and forests, many without ever knowing what they were truly fighting for. In 1863, everything changed with the Battle of Gettysburg. Over 3 days in July, more than 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. It was the bloodiest battle in American history. The Union held the line, and General Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces were forced to retreat, a turning point, though the war was far from over. That same year, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territories were now free. Though it didn't free everyone, and couldn't be enforced everywhere, it changed the war's meaning. The Union wasn't just fighting for unity anymore. It was fighting for human freedom. Black men, once enslaved, began to enlist in the Union Army by the tens of thousands. They fought with courage and conviction, knowing that their service was not just for victory, but for dignity. Their presence on the battlefield was a powerful answer to centuries of silence. In 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Georgia, burning cities, tearing up railroads, and breaking the South's ability to wage war. It was a brutal strategy, designed not just to defeat armies, but to shatter the will to resist. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was crumbling. On April 9th, at Appomattox Courthouse, General Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant. The war was over. Nearly 750,000 Americans had died, more than in any other conflict in the country's history. But even in victory, peace was fragile. 5 days later, President Lincoln was shot and killed in a theater in Washington. The man who had guided the nation through its darkest hour would not live to see its healing. And though the war had ended, the fight for freedom, justice, and unity was far from complete. The Civil War had ended, but the wounds it left behind were deep and raw. Cities in the South lay in ruins. Railroads were twisted metal. Plantations were abandoned. Entire communities were shattered, and over 4 million newly freed people stood on uncertain ground, free in law but not yet in life. This era would be called Reconstruction, a time when the nation attempted to rebuild itself not just physically, but morally and politically. It was a time of hope, anger, progress, and betrayal, all unfolding at once. President Andrew Johnson, who took office after Lincoln's assassination, faced the enormous task of reuniting the states. But Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had stayed loyal to the Union, believed in a quick and lenient approach. He allowed former Confederate leaders to return to power and offered generous pardons, hoping to speed up healing. But in the North, many were outraged. Was the war fought only to return things almost as they were? Meanwhile, in the South, freedom brought a new struggle. Formerly enslaved men and women built schools, opened churches, ran for office, and tried to reconnect families that had been torn apart. The 13th Amendment had ended slavery. The 14th promised equal protection under the law. The 15th granted black men the right to vote. On paper, it seemed like a new dawn. And for a brief moment, it was. Black Americans were elected to local and national positions. New state constitutions guaranteed rights and education. Union troops protected polling stations. The dream of a multiracial democracy seemed within reach. But resistance came swiftly. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose from the shadows, using fear and violence to suppress black voters and silence progress. Southern states passed laws known as Black Codes, and later Jim Crow laws, designed to limit freedoms, enforce segregation, and reassert control through a new kind of oppression. Northern support for Reconstruction began to fade. Economic concerns, political fatigue, and racial prejudice shifted attention away from the South. By 1877, federal troops were withdrawn, and the era came to an end, not with celebration, but with retreat. In the decades that followed, the South slipped into a system of legalized segregation. Voting rights were stripped through poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. Lynchings became a tool of terror. The promise of equality, once so close, drifted further out of reach. Meanwhile, the rest of the country surged ahead. Railroads expanded westward at a breathtaking pace. Towns became cities. The frontier, once vast and wild, was shrinking fast. For many Americans, the late 1800s were an age of invention and industry. For others, it was an age of struggle and exclusion. Immigrants arrived in droves, chasing the American dream, only to find overcrowded tenements and factory floors. Native American tribes were forced onto reservations as settlers took their lands, and buffalo herds vanished. The war had ended the Union's greatest crisis, but it had not answered its deepest questions. And as the 20th century approached, the United States stood at a crossroads once again, powerful, restless, and uncertain of what kind of country it truly wanted to be. As the 19th century closed, the United States transformed from a mostly rural country into an industrial powerhouse. Factories rose along rivers and railways, steam engines powered trains and ships, and cities swelled with people from all over the world. Skyscrapers began to pierce the sky, and the hum of machines became the soundtrack of progress. This era, known as the Gilded Age, was a time of both dazzling wealth and deep inequality. Captains of industry like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller amassed fortunes by building steel empires and oil monopolies. Their successes fueled railroads stretching coast to coast, linking the country in ways once unimaginable. Yet for many workers, life was harsh. Long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions were common. Child labor filled factories and mines. Immigrants arrived in droves, often facing discrimination and crowded tenements. Labor unions began to organize strikes and protests, fighting for rights and dignity. Meanwhile, America's reach extended beyond its borders. The Spanish-American War in 1898 marked a turning point, when the United States defeated Spain and gained territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The country was no longer just a continent, it was becoming a global power. Social reforms also took root. Progressives pushed for better education, safer food, and women's suffrage. The idea that government should serve the people more directly grew stronger. But even as the nation modernized, old conflicts simmered. Racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence against Black Americans persisted, especially in the South. Native American tribes were confined to reservations, their cultures under attack. By the early 1900s, America was a land of contrasts: wealth and poverty, hope and injustice, opportunity and struggle. The question lingered: how would this young nation navigate the promises and pitfalls of modern life? The dawn of the 20th century brought both excitement and uncertainty. America's cities bustled with life, the sounds of factories and streetcars filling the air. Immigrants arrived by the millions, stepping off ships into Ellis Island, hopeful for a new beginning but often facing harsh realities. Tenement buildings housed families in cramped quarters, and the gap between rich and poor grew ever wider. Progressivism emerged as a powerful force, aiming to reform society and politics. Reformers battled corruption in government, fought for labor rights, and sought to improve public health. Women organized tirelessly, demanding the right to vote, and their voices grew louder with each passing year. The 19th Amendment, granting women suffrage, would finally arrive in 1920, a hard-won victory after decades of struggle. The nation also began to look outward. The United States entered World War I in 1917, joining the Allies against the Central Powers. Though America's involvement was relatively brief, it marked the country's first major step onto the world stage as a global power. Millions of young men were drafted, trained, and sent across the ocean. The war brought sacrifice and sorrow, but also a new sense of unity and purpose. After the war, the 1920s arrived, a decade known as the Roaring Twenties. Jazz music filled dance halls, flappers challenged social norms, and technological marvels like the automobile changed how people lived and moved. Radios brought news and entertainment into homes nationwide, shrinking distances and connecting lives. Yet beneath the glitz and glamour lay deep contradictions. Prohibition, the nationwide ban on alcohol, gave rise to speakeasies, organized crime, and widespread lawbreaking. Racial tensions simmered and sometimes exploded into violence. The Ku Klux Klan reemerged, targeting African Americans, immigrants, and other minority groups. And then, in 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression descended like a dark cloud. Factories closed, banks failed, and unemployment soared. Families lost homes and hope. The nation's optimism was shattered, and the future looked uncertain. President Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped into this crisis with a bold vision. His New Deal programs aimed to provide relief, recovery, and reform. Public works projects built roads, schools, and parks. Social Security offered a safety net. Though not without controversy, Roosevelt's leadership restored faith in government and offered a path forward. As the 1930s wore on, the world grew darker. Dictators rose in Europe and Asia. Threats of another global conflict loomed. America stood at another crossroads. Between isolation and engagement, fear and courage, old ways, and new challenges. As the 1930s drew to a close, the clouds of war darkened over Europe and Asia. Adolf Hitler's Germany, Benito Mussolini's Italy, and Imperial Japan sought to expand their territories aggressively, threatening the fragile peace that had barely held since World War I. Meanwhile, the United States, scarred by the Great Depression and wary of foreign entanglements, largely clung to a policy of isolationism. But neutrality would not last forever. In 1941, everything changed with a sudden, devastating attack. On December 7th, Japanese planes struck the naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, crippling the Pacific Fleet and plunging the United States into World War II. The phrase, "a date which will live in infamy," spoken by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, captured the shock and resolve of a nation suddenly at war. The war effort united Americans across the country. Men and women enlisted in the millions. Factories shifted from making cars and appliances to tanks, planes, and weapons. Rationing, victory gardens, and war bonds became part of daily life. Women stepped into roles traditionally held by men, symbolized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter. Fighting raged on multiple fronts. In Europe, Allied forces faced the brutal tyranny of Nazi Germany. The D-Day invasion of Normandy in 1944 marked a turning point, as American, British, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches to begin liberating Western Europe. In the Pacific, fierce battles on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa brought intense hardship and sacrifice. The war also revealed some of humanity's darkest moments. The Holocaust, the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others by the Nazis, shocked the world. Liberation of concentration camps exposed horrors that forced a global reckoning with evil. After nearly 4 years of brutal conflict, the war ended in 1945. The United States emerged as a superpower, its economy strengthened and its military unmatched. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki hastened Japan's surrender, but also introduced the terrifying era of nuclear weapons. Yet victory came with new challenges. The world was now divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in an uneasy and dangerous Cold War. The ideological battle between democracy and communism shaped global politics for decades to come. At home, America faced its own struggles. Returning veterans sought to rebuild lives. The GI Bill opened opportunities for education and homeownership, transforming society. But racial segregation and discrimination persisted, fueling the burgeoning civil rights movement. The story of America continued, a nation grappling with its ideals, its contradictions, and its place in a rapidly changing world. The decades following World War II were a time of rapid change and profound challenge. The Cold War dominated foreign policy, with the United States and the Soviet Union locked in a tense standoff marked by arms races, espionage, and proxy wars in far-off lands like Korea and Vietnam. The threat of nuclear annihilation loomed, casting a shadow over daily life. Meanwhile, at home, the promise of equality remained unfulfilled for millions of Americans. African Americans and other marginalized groups faced systemic discrimination, segregation, and violence. The civil rights movement rose as a powerful force demanding justice and an end to racial inequality. In 1954, the Supreme Court delivered a landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education, declaring segregation in public schools unconstitutional. This ruling challenged the deeply entrenched system of separate but equal and sparked a wave of activism and resistance. Yet, change was slow and met with fierce opposition. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr. emerged, preaching nonviolent resistance and inspiring millions with speeches that echoed the nation's founding ideals of freedom and justice. Marches, sit-ins, and boycotts became daily acts of courage. The 1963 March on Washington, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, was a watershed moment. Civil rights legislation followed, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, dismantling legal segregation and protecting voting rights. However, the fight was far from over. Racial tensions, economic inequality, and social unrest continued to challenge the nation. At the same time, the 1960s brought cultural revolutions. Young people questioned authority, embraced new music and art, and pushed for expanded rights for women, LGBTQ+ individuals, and other marginalized communities. The feminist movement gained momentum, challenging traditional roles and fighting for equality in the workplace and beyond. Meanwhile, America became deeply involved in the Vietnam War, a conflict that divided the nation. Protests erupted across college campuses and cities, with many questioning the purpose and morality of the war. The war's end in 1975 left scars on both the country and its veterans. In politics, the Watergate scandal of the 1970s shattered trust in government, leading to President Nixon's resignation. Economic challenges like inflation and energy crises tested the resilience of the American economy. Despite these struggles, America continued to grow and adapt. The late 20th century saw advances in technology, space exploration, and medicine. The Cold War ended peacefully, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, ushering in a new era of global relations. As the millennium turned, the United States faced new questions about identity, justice, and its role in the world, questions that continue to shape the nation's story today. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, America stood at a crossroads of opportunity and uncertainty. The technology revolution transformed daily life, bringing computers, the internet, and smartphones that connected people across the globe instantly. Cities grew taller and more diverse, and cultural influence spread worldwide through music, movies, and fashion. Yet beneath the surface, new challenges emerged. The attacks of September 11, 2001, shocked the nation to its core, forever changing America's sense of security. Terrorism became a central focus of foreign and domestic policy, leading to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The human cost was immense, and the political debates were fierce. Economic shifts reshaped the country as well. The Great Recession of 2008 brought hardship to millions, revealing vulnerabilities in the financial system. Recovery was slow and uneven, sparking conversations about inequality and the American dream's meaning in a changing economy. Social movements gained strength. The election of Barack Obama in 2008, the first African American president, symbolized progress and hope for many. At the same time, issues like racial justice, immigration, and LGBTQ+ rights fueled activism and political debate. Movements such as Black Lives Matter arose in response to ongoing systemic injustices, demanding change and accountability. America's political landscape grew more polarized. Debates over health care, immigration, climate change, and the country's role in global affairs often divided citizens sharply. Yet, amid conflict, the nation's ideals of democracy, freedom, and opportunity continue to inspire. On the global stage, America faced new competitors and complex challenges: rising powers, pandemics, and the urgent threat of climate change. Its military remained formidable, but questions about intervention and diplomacy grew louder. Through all these changes, the core story remained: a nation shaped by its history, its struggles, and its hopes for a better future. The journey from 13 colonies to a global superpower was marked by contradictions and challenges, but also resilience and reinvention. As the story continues, America remains a work in progress, a place where the promise of freedom and equality is still being written by each generation. The story of the United States is far from finished. In the 21st century, the nation continues to evolve, reflecting both its extraordinary achievements and ongoing struggles. From bustling cities to quiet small towns, from technological breakthroughs to cultural revolutions, America remains a place of dreams and debates. The challenges of recent decades have been many. Political polarization has deepened, raising questions about unity and democracy itself. Issues of racial justice, economic inequality, immigration, and climate change continue to spark passionate discussions and activism. The nation grapples with how to live up to the ideals of liberty and justice for all. Yet the spirit of innovation and resilience remains strong. Advances in medicine, science, and technology are transforming lives. People from around the world still look to America as a land of opportunity, creativity, and freedom. Movements for social change continue to push the nation toward a more inclusive future. The COVID-19 pandemic tested the country's strength and unity in unprecedented ways. It exposed vulnerabilities, but also inspired communities to come together, innovate, and support one another. This global crisis reminded Americans and the world that challenges can be overcome through cooperation, science, and compassion. Politically, the United States remains a vibrant, sometimes messy, democracy. Elections bring change, debate, and the constant push to define what America stands for. The nation wrestles with balancing tradition and progress, diversity and unity, power and justice. Looking ahead, the future is uncertain, shaped by the choices of its people. The lessons of history remind us that progress is possible but requires effort, empathy, and courage. The promise of America has always been about striving for a more perfect union, even when that goal seems distant. From the first colonies to the present day, the United States has been a story of transformation, conflict, and hope. It is a story written by countless voices, indigenous peoples, immigrants, pioneers, leaders, and everyday citizens, all contributing to the ongoing experiment of freedom. As this story continues to unfold, one thing remains clear: America's journey is a work in progress, ever changing, always challenging, and forever inspiring.